In 1999, Cathy Hughes stood on the floor of the NASDAQ after taking her company public, becoming the first Black woman to lead a publicly traded media company in the United States. It was an astonishing victory for a single mother who had once lost her home, slept on the floor of her struggling radio station with her young son, and risked everything to stay on the air. That desperate gamble grew into a media empire worth more than $1 billion. This is the extraordinary story of how Cathy Hughes built Urban One against seemingly impossible odds. Chapter 1. The Woman Who Refused to Quit. In 1979, Cathy Hughes found herself standing at the lowest point of her life. She wasn't a media executive or a millionaire. She was a single mother with mounting debts, a failing career, and almost no one willing to bet on her future. Within months, she would risk everything she had on a struggling radio station in Washington. If it failed, she would lose not only her business, but the only stable future she could offer her young son. Long before Wall Street knew her name, Hughes was born on April 22, 1947, in Omaha. She grew up in a household where achievement was expected rather than admired. Her father, William Alfred Woods, was an accountant who became the first Black man to earn that position at the Omaha Housing Authority. Her mother, Helen Jones Woods, was a gifted trombonist who later became one of the first Black female officers in the United States Army before building a career in broadcasting. Their accomplishments showed Cathy that barriers could be broken, but only through relentless determination. It was her mother's career in radio that left the deepest impression. As a teenager, Cathy spent hours inside radio stations, watching announcers speak directly to thousands of listeners she could never see. She became fascinated by the power of a microphone. A single voice could inform communities, entertain families, and shape public opinion. While many young people dreamed of becoming singers or actors, Hughes dreamed of working behind the microphone. She began her broadcasting career while still in her teens, taking on small jobs at local radio stations and learning every aspect of the business. She wasn't satisfied with simply reading scripts. She wanted to understand programming, advertising, audience behavior, and the mechanics that kept a station on the air. Those lessons would prove invaluable years later, though she had no way of knowing it at the time. Her personal life, however, was far less stable than her professional ambitions. A marriage ended in divorce, leaving Hughes to raise her son, Alfred Liggins, largely on her own. Like many single parents, she balanced long working hours with the constant responsibility of providing for a child. Every career decision carried greater risk because failure would affect more than just her. By the late 1970s, Hughes had earned respect within the broadcasting industry, but respect didn't translate into financial security. She had worked for several stations, served in management roles, and developed innovative programming ideas. Yet she remained frustrated by one persistent reality. Very few radio stations were owned by Black entrepreneurs, and even fewer were programmed specifically for Black audiences. Important decisions about Black communities were often being made by executives who neither lived in nor fully understood those communities. Rather than accept that reality, Hughes began imagining something far more ambitious. She wanted to own a radio station herself, not simply to make money, but to create programming that genuinely reflected the lives, struggles, and aspirations of Black listeners. It was a bold vision, especially for a single mother with limited financial resources. Banks were reluctant to finance minority entrepreneurs, and investors saw little opportunity in stations serving predominantly Black audiences. Still, Hughes refused to let the idea go. She believed there was an audience that mainstream broadcasters had overlooked for years. If she could somehow acquire the right station, she was convinced she could turn it into something extraordinary. That opportunity arrived in 1980, when a struggling AM station called WOL became available. Most people saw a failing business with declining ratings. Cathy Hughes saw the chance she had been waiting for, and she was prepared to risk everything to seize it. Chapter 2. Sleeping on the radio station floor. In 1980, the opportunity Cathy Hughes had been waiting for finally arrived. A struggling AM radio station, WOL 1450 in Washington, was available for purchase. On paper, it looked like a terrible investment. The station's audience had declined, its finances were fragile, and many industry insiders believed AM radio was losing relevance. Most investors saw a business in decline. Hughes saw something entirely different, a direct line to a community that had been overlooked for decades. Buying the station, however, was only the beginning. Finding the money to keep it alive proved even harder. Banks showed little interest in financing a black woman with limited capital who wanted to buy a struggling radio station. Investors questioned whether programming aimed primarily at black audiences could ever generate meaningful profits. The skepticism wasn't just about the station. It reflected the broader barriers black entrepreneurs faced when trying to enter industries dominated by established media companies. Despite the doubts, Hughes refused to walk away. She secured financing through a combination of loans and determined negotiation, eventually taking control of WOL alongside her business partners. Almost immediately, reality set in. Revenue was inconsistent, bills accumulated quickly, and every month became a struggle to keep the station on the air. There was rarely enough money left after paying employees, maintaining equipment, and covering operating expenses. As the financial pressure intensified, Hughes made a decision that would later become one of the defining images of her career. To reduce expenses, she and her young son, Alfred Liggins, moved into the radio station itself. They slept on the floor, bathed in the station's restroom, and treated the building as both an office and a home. During the day, Hughes managed employees, negotiated with advertisers, and hosted radio programs. At night, after the microphones were turned off and the staff had gone home, she prepared a place for her son to sleep before doing the same herself. Years later, Alfred would recall watching his mother work almost nonstop. While other children returned home after school, he went to the station, helping with small tasks whenever he could. He witnessed the uncertainty, the long hours, and the constant pressure of wondering whether the business would survive another month. Those experiences would shape his own understanding of leadership and entrepreneurship. Hughes knew that cutting costs alone would never save WOL. If the station was going to survive, it needed listeners, and that meant offering something competitors didn't. Instead of copying other broadcasters, she focused on understanding the daily lives of Black Washington residents. She believed radio should feel like a trusted conversation rather than a distant broadcast. One of her boldest programming decisions was introducing a late-night format known as the Quiet Storm. Rather than filling the evening with fast-paced talk or energetic music, the program featured smooth rhythm and blues, thoughtful conversation, and a calm atmosphere designed for listeners winding down after work. It was a risk because nothing quite like it existed in the market. Yet almost immediately, audiences responded. Ratings improved, advertisers began to take notice, and WOL slowly started building a loyal following. The success of the Quiet Storm revealed something far more important than higher ratings. Hughes had proven that Black audiences weren't underserved because they lacked interest. They were underserved because few broadcasters had taken the time to understand what they actually wanted. That insight became the foundation of her business philosophy. She wasn't merely selling airtime. She was building trust with a community that finally heard itself reflected on the radio. The station was no longer simply surviving. For the first time, it was showing signs of real momentum. But Hughes had no intention of stopping with one radio station. If her formula could transform WOL, she believed it could transform an entire industry. The next step wasn't just to own a successful station. It was to build a network that Black America could truly call its own. Chapter 3. Building a Radio Empire. The turnaround at WOL did more than save a struggling radio station. It validated Cathy Hughes' entire vision. Advertisers who had once dismissed the station began paying attention as ratings climbed. More importantly, Black listeners proved they would support a broadcaster that understood their communities instead of simply marketing to them. Hughes realized she wasn't just running a successful station, she had discovered a business model that could be repeated in cities across America. During the 1980s, she focused on disciplined expansion rather than rapid growth. Instead of chasing the biggest markets, Hughes looked for stations with untapped potential properties that larger media companies had overlooked or undervalued. Her strategy was straightforward: acquire a station, understand the local community, hire talent that connected with listeners, and deliver programming that reflected the audience's culture, interests, and everyday experiences. It was a formula that many competitors underestimated. Growth required constant sacrifice. Every acquisition demanded financing, and every loan carried enormous risk. Unlike major broadcasting corporations with easy access to capital, Hughes often had to persuade lenders that Black-focused media could generate reliable returns. It was a difficult argument to make during a period when minority-owned businesses received only a small fraction of commercial lending. Time and again, she found herself having to prove what her ratings were already demonstrating. As the company expanded, Hughes also changed the way advertisers viewed Black audiences. For years, many national brands had invested relatively little in Black radio because they underestimated its influence and purchasing power. Hughes challenged that assumption directly. She presented data, audience research, and market performance to show that Black consumers represented a loyal and economically significant market. Slowly, major advertisers began increasing their investments, providing the revenue needed to fuel further expansion. Her greatest advantage, however, wasn't financial, it was cultural. Hughes believed local radio personalities should sound like the communities they served. Listeners weren't looking for polished corporate broadcasts. They wanted familiar voices discussing issues that mattered to their neighborhoods. That approach created unusually loyal audiences and distinguished her stations from competitors that relied on generic programming. By the early 1990s, Hughes was ready for a much larger stage. She formally established Radio 1 as the vehicle through which her growing collection of stations would operate. The timing proved ideal. Changes in the broadcasting industry were creating opportunities to acquire additional stations, while demand for Black-focused programming continued to grow. Radio 1 steadily expanded into major metropolitan markets, building a presence that few would have imagined possible just a decade earlier. The company was no longer defined by survival. It had become one of the fastest-growing Black-owned media businesses in the country. Yet Hughes understood that owning dozens of successful stations wasn't the ultimate goal. If she wanted to compete with America's largest media companies, she needed access to something she had struggled to obtain throughout her career: serious capital. That opportunity arrived toward the end of the decade. It would take Cathy Hughes from radio stations in local communities to the floor of Wall Street, making history in a way no Black woman in American media ever had before. Chapter 4. Wall Street finally took notice. By the late 1990s, Cathy Hughes had accomplished something few people thought was possible. The single mother who had once slept on the floor of a struggling radio station now owned one of the fastest-growing radio companies in the United States. But Hughes understood that the next stage of growth required something far bigger than determination. Expanding into new markets meant acquiring more stations, investing in better technology, and competing against media giants with far deeper pockets. To do that, she needed access to Wall Street. In 1999, Radio 1 made its debut on the NASDAQ. It was a landmark moment in American business history. Cathy Hughes became the first Black woman to chair and lead a publicly traded company in the United States. For many investors, it was another initial public offering. For Hughes, it represented nearly 2 decades of sacrifice, persistence, and refusing to accept the limitations others had placed on her. The IPO transformed Radio 1 almost overnight. The capital raised allowed the company to accelerate its acquisition strategy, purchasing stations in major cities across the country. Markets such as Atlanta, Detroit, Houston, Philadelphia, and Dallas became part of a growing network dedicated to serving Black audiences. Within a few years, Radio 1 had assembled the largest collection of radio stations targeting African American listeners anywhere in the country. Investors also began recognizing something Hughes had believed for years. Black audiences were not a niche market. They represented a powerful consumer base with enormous cultural and economic influence. National advertisers increased their spending, while local businesses embraced stations that had become trusted voices within their communities. What many companies had overlooked for decades was now becoming one of the media industry's strongest competitive advantages. The company's success extended beyond music and entertainment. Hughes encouraged programming that addressed issues affecting Black communities, including education, health, entrepreneurship, politics, and economic opportunity. Her stations became more than places to hear songs. They became platforms where communities could exchange ideas, celebrate achievements, and discuss challenges that mainstream media often ignored. It was this combination of commercial success and community connection that distinguished Radio 1 from its competitors. As the new century began, Radio 1 continued expanding through strategic acquisitions, eventually operating more than 70 radio stations in dozens of American markets. Hughes had built exactly what she envisioned years earlier, a Black-owned media company with national influence. The little station that banks once considered a risky investment had evolved into an empire worth more than $1 billion. Yet success brought an entirely new challenge. The media landscape was beginning to change faster than ever before. Satellite radio, internet streaming, podcasts, and social media were reshaping how audiences consumed content. The business model that had fueled Radio 1's extraordinary rise would soon face its greatest test. But the most remarkable part of Cathy Hughes' story wasn't building the empire, it was finding a way to reinvent it before the industry changed forever. Chapter 5. Reinventing the Empire. The early 2000s marked a turning point for every traditional media company in America. Radio was no longer competing only with other radio stations. Audiences were spending more time online. Satellite radio was gaining subscribers, and streaming services were beginning to change listening habits. At the same time, advertisers had more choices than ever before, forcing broadcasters to compete for shrinking marketing budgets. For many media companies, the answer was to cut costs and hope radio would recover. Cathy Hughes believed the future demanded something different. She had spent her entire career proving that Black audiences were underserved, not unreachable. If those audiences were consuming content on new platforms, then her company had to follow them. Hughes understood that remaining a radio company would eventually limit growth. To stay relevant, Radio 1 needed to become a broader media business. One of the company's biggest moves came in 2004 with the launch of TV One, a television network created specifically for African American viewers. Established through a partnership with Comcast, TV One expanded the company's reach beyond radio for the first time. Instead of relying solely on music and talk shows, the network invested in original entertainment, documentaries, movies, and news programming that reflected stories often overlooked by mainstream television. It was another extension of the philosophy Hughes had followed since buying WOL to serve an audience that others underestimated. The company also strengthened its digital presence. Recognizing that younger audiences were consuming more content online, Radio 1 expanded into websites, digital advertising, podcasts, and streaming platforms. Rather than treating digital media as a threat, Hughes encouraged the business to embrace it. The goal was no longer simply to own radio stations but to connect with audiences wherever they chose to consume content. The journey, however, wasn't without setbacks. Like many broadcasting companies, Radio 1 was heavily affected by the Great Recession. Advertising revenue declined, debt became more difficult to manage, and investors questioned whether traditional media companies could maintain their previous valuations. Hughes and her leadership team were forced to make difficult financial decisions while continuing to invest in the company's long-term future. It was one of the toughest periods since the early days of WOL, but the company endured. In 2017, the business took another important step by changing its corporate name from Radio 1 to Urban One. The new name reflected what the company had already become. It was no longer defined by radio alone. Urban One now operated radio stations, television networks, digital media platforms, podcast businesses, and event properties, reaching millions of consumers across multiple channels. The rebranding wasn't about abandoning radio. It was about acknowledging that the empire had grown far beyond it. Throughout this transformation, Hughes gradually entrusted more day-to-day leadership to her son, Alfred Liggins. Having witnessed the company's struggles from childhood, even sleeping beside his mother inside WOL, Liggins understood the mission better than anyone. Under his leadership, Urban One continued investing in digital media while preserving the community-first philosophy that had defined the company from the beginning. More than 4 decades after risking everything on a failing AM station, Cathy Hughes had achieved something few entrepreneurs ever accomplish. She hadn't simply built a successful business, she had built one capable of adapting across generations of technological change. That resilience may be her greatest achievement of all. The billion-dollar valuation made headlines, but the true legacy of Urban One lies in the communities it empowered, the voices it amplified, and the doors it opened for those who dared to believe that ownership could change the future. Chapter 6. More than a billion-dollar business. For Cathy Hughes, success was never measured solely by the number of radio stations she owned or the value of Urban One. Those achievements were significant, but they were never the ultimate goal. From the very beginning, she believed that ownership mattered because it determined whose stories were told, whose voices were amplified, and whose communities were represented. Building a media company wasn't simply about creating wealth, it was about creating influence. That philosophy shaped Urban One for decades. While many broadcasters pursued the broadest possible audience, Hughes remained committed to serving Black America with authenticity. The company gave opportunities to journalists, radio hosts, producers, and executives who might never have received them elsewhere. It covered issues that larger networks often ignored and celebrated culture that deserved a national platform. In doing so, Urban One became more than a broadcaster. It became an institution within Black media. Hughes also became a role model for entrepreneurs far beyond the broadcasting industry. Her story was unlike the typical Silicon Valley success. She didn't build her empire with venture capital or billion-dollar funding rounds. She built it through persistence, long hours, difficult sacrifices, and an unwavering belief that an underserved audience deserved better. That journey inspired countless business owners, particularly women and minority entrepreneurs, who saw in her proof that barriers could be broken, even in industries where ownership had long been out of reach. One of the most remarkable parts of her legacy is that it became a family legacy. The young boy who once slept beside her on the floor of WOL grew up to lead the very company his mother fought to save. Under Alfred Liggins, Urban One has continued evolving through television, digital publishing, podcasts, streaming, and live events, ensuring that the company remains relevant in an industry that never stops changing. Few family businesses successfully transition from one generation to the next. Urban One accomplished exactly that. Today, Urban One reaches millions of Americans through dozens of radio stations, national television, and digital platforms. But perhaps the company's greatest contribution can't be measured by audience size or market value. It proved that media companies serving Black audiences could compete at the highest level, attract major advertisers, and become billion-dollar enterprises without abandoning the communities that made them successful. Looking back, it's astonishing how close this story came to ending before it truly began. If Cathy Hughes had accepted the rejection of skeptical lenders, if she had walked away from WOL when the bills piled up, or if she had decided the sacrifices were simply too great, one of America's most influential Black-owned media companies might never have existed. Instead, a single mother who once slept on the floor of a struggling radio station built an empire that changed American media forever. Her greatest achievement wasn't simply becoming the first Black woman to lead a publicly traded media company. It was proving that determination, vision, and ownership could create opportunities for millions of others long after her own success was secured. Some empires are built with billions of dollars. Others begin with a single opportunity that everyone else overlooks. Cathy Hughes proved that the greatest advantage in business isn't always money. It's having the courage to believe in a vision long before anyone else does. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Black Status for more incredible business stories, and tell us in the comments which empire you'd like us to cover next. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.